I was fired while the room gave a standing ovation to my boss's daughter for crossing $100 million in sales using the system I built for 6 years. 11 minutes after my keycard died, my phone rang. Not human resources, a board member begging me to return before Monday morning. The chilling truth hit me instantly. They did not call for justice. The ship was sinking, and only I knew where the real hole was. My name is Bailey Cook. I am 36 years old, and until exactly 10:14 on a rainy Friday morning, I thought I was untouchable. The air inside the executive boardroom of Vantage Arc Dynamics was climate-controlled to a brisk 68 degrees, but I was running on the pure, heated adrenaline of a winning pitch. Our headquarters, a gleaming glass monument to corporate growth solutions in the heart of Charlotte, demanded perfection, and I was currently delivering it on a silver platter. I clicked to the final slide of my quarterly report. The bar graphs glowed in crisp company blue, stretching proudly upward. "As you can see," I said, projecting my voice to reach the mahogany-paneled walls, "my division has not only retained all Tier 1 enterprise accounts, but we have exceeded our quarterly quota by 29%. The behavioral mapping framework we implemented 6 months ago is drastically reducing decision friction." I paused, expecting the usual nods of approval from the executive team, perhaps a polite murmur of validation. Instead, the heavy oak double doors at the back of the room opened, and Rowan Mercer, our chief executive officer, stepped up to the head of the table. He did not look at the glowing numbers. He looked at me, his eyes possessing the warmth of a cracked glacier. "Thank you, Bailey. That will be all," Rowan said. His voice was unnervingly flat, carrying a practiced corporate neutrality that instantly made my stomach drop. "However, the framework you just praised is precisely why we are making an immediate leadership transition." I blinked, my hand freezing over the presentation remote. "Rowan, I do not understand. The numbers are right there. 29% growth. Growth at the cost of culture is a liability," Rowan interrupted smoothly. He leaned forward, placing his palms flat against the polished wood. "The executive committee has reviewed your recent operational methods. We have concluded that your aggressive hoarding of account control is actively disrupting the revenue process. Furthermore, your refusal to collaborate is damaging internal synergy. Effective immediately, your employment at Vantage Arc Dynamics is terminated." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of vacuum where sound goes to die. 42 executives, directors, and managers sat perfectly still. No one breathed. No one shifted in their ergonomic leather chairs. Terminated. The word felt like sandpaper in my throat. I built this entire revenue architecture from scratch. I brought in those accounts. Before Rowan could answer, a chair scraped against the floorboards. Sloan Mercer, Rowan's 26-year-old daughter and newly minted vice president of strategy, stood up. She wore a tailored ivory suit that probably cost more than my first car, and her smile was a perfectly calibrated weapon of faux humility. "We appreciate your groundwork, Bailey," Sloan said, her tone dripping with rehearsed grace. "But Vantage Arc Dynamics is moving into a new era of collaborative scale. In fact, I am thrilled to announce to the board that as of this morning, under our new unified growth model, I have officially led the company past the $100 million sales mark." A physical wave of nausea hit me. I stared at Sloan, trying to process the sheer audacity of her statement. $100 million. I knew that number. I had forecasted that number. "I am incredibly proud of the team," Sloan continued, pacing slowly toward the projector screen, effectively physically displacing me from the front of the room. "We successfully closed the expansions for Apex Industries, the Vanguard Group, and most importantly, our strategic renewal with Blackridge Health Consortium." My blood turned to ice. Apex, Vanguard, Blackridge. Those were not just accounts, they were my accounts. I had spent the last 4 years dining with their procurement officers, analyzing their churn data, mapping out their friction points, and personally designing the custom deployment solutions that kept them locked into our ecosystem. Sloan had never even been on a solo call with Blackridge. Her only contribution had been silently shadowing my meetings for the past 2 months, furiously taking notes under the guise of learning the ropes. "You did not close Blackridge," I said, my voice rising, abandoning the polite corporate register. "I negotiated the deployment addendum for Blackridge on Tuesday. You just copied my strategy deck." Rowan held up a hand, silencing me without raising his voice. "Bailey, do not make this harder than it needs to be. We are not here to debate. The decision is final." "This is theft," I fired back, my vision narrowing. I looked around the table, desperately seeking a lifeline. I made eye contact with David from marketing. He looked down at his legal pad. I looked at Sarah, my own director of operations. She suddenly found her coffee cup fascinating. No one dared to look me in the eye. They were terrified of the Mercers. Rowan did not even bother to argue. He simply gave a subtle nod toward the back of the room. 2 broad-shouldered men in gray security uniforms stepped through the doors. They had been waiting in the hall the entire time. The execution had been fully choreographed before I even walked into the room. "Please escort Miss Cook to her desk to collect her personal effects, and then see her out of the building," Rowan instructed the guards. "Rowan, you cannot do this," I said, my voice trembling now, not from fear, but from the overwhelming, suffocating weight of public humiliation. "You are handing a complex, multi-million-dollar infrastructure to someone who does not understand the first thing about behavioral retention." "Goodbye, Bailey," Rowan said, turning his back on me to look at his daughter. As if on cue, the chief financial officer began to clap. Then the head of human resources joined in. Within seconds, the entire room was standing, offering a thunderous standing ovation to Sloan Mercer for her historic achievement. The sound of their applause felt like physical blows. They were clapping for the theft of my life's work. The security guards flanked me, their hands hovering just inches from my elbows, ready to use force if I resisted. I had no choice. I set the presentation remote down on the table. It felt 10 times heavier than it should have. Keeping my chin high, I walked down the center aisle of the boardroom, running the gauntlet of applause intended for the woman who had just robbed me blind. The walk to my desk was a blur of fluorescent lights and gray carpet. The open-plan office, usually buzzing with the frantic energy of a sales floor, was eerily quiet as I approached. Word had clearly spread through the internal messaging channels faster than I could walk. I pulled a standard cardboard box from the supply closet and began aggressively throwing my life into it. Framed photos, a specialized mechanical keyboard, my favorite ceramic mug. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped the mug. The guards stood a respectful but firm distance away, their presence a screaming neon sign to every junior associate watching from their cubicles. I was a dead woman walking, a cautionary tale about what happens when you mistake competence for security in a family-run kingdom. I reached into my top drawer to grab my emergency stash of protein bars. As my fingers brushed the bottom of the drawer, they hit something small, hard, and metallic that did not belong there. I paused, shielding my hand with a stack of old files. I pulled the object out. It was a tiny, unmarked silver USB drive. I stared at it for a fraction of a second. I had never seen it before. My desk had been locked when I left the night before, and I was extremely fastidious about my hardware. Someone had intentionally slipped this into my drawer while I was in the boardroom being slaughtered. My pulse, already racing, hammered against my ribs. I did not know what was on the drive, but I knew instantly that the narrative the Mercers were spinning had a leak. Not everyone in this glass tower was loyal to the throne. I slipped the drive discreetly into the pocket of my blazer, sweeping the remaining items into the box. "I am done," I told the guards. They escorted me to the elevator bank, rode down with me in suffocating silence, and marched me across the sprawling marble lobby. When they took my corporate keycard, the finality of it snapped into place. I was locked out of the empire I had built. The glass double doors slid open, and I stepped out into the brutal Charlotte weather. The sky had cracked open, unleashing a torrential downpour. I did not have an umbrella. Within seconds, My silk blouse clung to my skin, and the cardboard box in my arms began to sag under the weight of the water. I stood on the sidewalk, the cold rain mixing with the hot tears of pure, unadulterated rage that finally spilled over my eyelashes. 6 years. 6 years of 80-hour weeks, missed holidays, and relentless grinding, all handed to a spoiled heiress with a borrowed vocabulary. Then, muffled beneath the sound of the driving rain, my cell phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I shifted the dissolving box to my hip and pulled the phone out. I expected to see a notification from Human Resources about my severance package, or maybe a message from a sympathetic, albeit cowardly, colleague. The caller ID flashed a name that made me freeze. Elliot Vale. Elliot was not just anyone. He was the most aggressive, ruthless partner at the venture capital firm that backed Vantage Arc Dynamics. He was the lead independent member of our board of directors. He was the man who essentially held Rowan Mercer's leash. Why in the world was the board calling a terminated employee 11 minutes after her keycard was deactivated? I swiped the wet screen to answer, pressing the phone to my ear. Hello? Bailey, tell me you have not driven away yet. Elliot's voice barked through the speaker. There was no corporate polish in his tone today. He sounded breathless. He sounded panicked. I am currently standing in the rain holding a wet cardboard box. Elliot, what do you want? I asked, my voice devoid of any deference. I had nothing left to lose. I need you to come back inside, right now, Elliot demanded over the crackle of a bad connection. Your CEO just had me escorted out by armed security, I replied coldly. I think my return would damage internal synergy. Damn Rowan and damn his synergy, Elliot snapped. Listen to me very carefully. Bailey, Blackridge Health Consortium just called my direct line. They are freezing the entire $100 million expansion contract. They are threatening to pull their legacy business as well. I stood perfectly still as the rain pounded against my shoulders. They said they do not care who the vice president of strategy is. Elliot continued, the desperation bleeding through his authoritative facade. They said the system implementation is highly volatile, and they will only speak to the architect. They demanded to speak to you. If we do not get them back to the table before the markets open on Monday morning, this company is going to miss its debt covenants, and the whole house of cards comes down. I looked back up at the towering glass facade of Vantage Arc Dynamics. The anger that had been boiling inside me suddenly crystallized into something entirely different, something sharp, something dangerous. The board was not calling me because they realized a terrible injustice had occurred. They were not calling to apologize. They were calling because their golden ship had just hit an iceberg. It was taking on water fast, and they had just fired the only engineer who knew where the real holes were. I squeezed the USB drive through the fabric of my pocket. Where are you, Elliot? I asked, my voice completely steady. I am at the Capitol Grill 2 blocks down. I booked a private room, he said quickly. Name your price, Bailey. We will fix this. I hung up the phone without another word. I walked over to the nearest public trash can, dropped the soggy cardboard box of my personal belongings into it, and turned my face toward the restaurant. I was not just going to fix this, I was going to own them. I grew up in a dying industrial town in Ohio, where the air always smelled faintly of rust, wet asphalt, and impending layoffs. My mother was a night shift accountant at a massive auto parts stamping plant that was bleeding jobs by the hundreds every single fiscal quarter. I used to sit at our cramped kitchen table at 6 in the morning, eating cold cereal and watching her rub her exhausted eyes as she balanced complex ledgers for executives who would eventually lay her off 2 days before Christmas. That brutal morning was my first real education in the mechanics of corporate America. I learned very early, watching my mother pack her belongings into a plastic crate, that doing your job perfectly does not protect you. Hard work is a myth sold to the working class to keep them quiet. Merit is a shield made of wet paper. If you want to survive, you do not just do the work. You must own the machinery that makes the work possible. That deeply ingrained philosophy was exactly why I never fit the mold of the flashy, natural-born sales superstar When I entered the corporate tech world, I did not possess a charismatic golf swing. I did not take procurement officers to expensive steakhouses and charm them into signing multi-million-dollar contracts over aged bourbon and expensive cigars. I found the traditional sales bravado to be arrogant, exhausting, and mathematically inefficient. Instead, I treated revenue generation like a high-stakes psychological puzzle. I combined behavioral psychology, historical renewal data, and highly structured software deployment models to figure out exactly why a client was afraid to commit. 6 years ago, when I first walked through the glass doors of Vantage Arc Dynamics, the company was painfully mediocre. They were pulling in mid-level regional accounts, celebrating minor victories, and suffering from a catastrophic client churn rate. Their strategy was pure, unrefined brute force, the sales representatives to make 100 cold calls a day, send 50 automated emails, and pray for a miserable 2% conversion rate. I changed all of it by introducing a proprietary system I designed called the Decision Friction Map. The concept was entirely foreign to the aggressive, frat house sales culture Rowan Mercer had fostered. I forced my entire division to stop pitching shiny software features and start diagnosing psychological friction. I taught my team that a stalled enterprise contract was almost never about the price tag. It was entirely about the buyer's internal political risk. If a senior vice president at a global logistics firm buys our expensive software and the implementation fails, they lose their job and their reputation. I mapped out those exact fears. I created a rigorous, step-by-step diagnostic tool that anticipated every hesitation, structured the deployment timeline so the client saw immediate early wins, and essentially removed the word risk from their corporate vocabulary. The results were not just good, they were completely seismic. Within 18 months, our enterprise contracts surged by over 300%. Our client churn rate plummeted to the absolute lowest metric in the industry. We stopped fighting for regional scraps and started eating the market share of our largest, heavily funded competitors. The executive board suddenly found themselves sitting on top of an absolute goldmine, and they systematically built their entire 5-year growth ambitions squarely on the back of my methodology. Rowan Mercer, naturally, took the credit in the national business press, but internally, he loved to parade me around as the ultimate success story. "Look at Bailey," Rowan would say at every quarterly town hall meeting, gesturing toward me with an open palm while gripping a microphone. "She is the living embodiment of our company meritocracy. Pure grit, pure intelligence, and zero excuses." But the public praise was a highly calculated performance. Rowan liked showing me off as his prized racehorse, but he never actually shared the reins. Whenever I requested a formal seat on the executive steering committee or asked to convert my commission structure into actual equity shares, Rowan would deploy his signature paternalistic smile. "You are our absolute best player on the field. Bailey," he would tell me, patting the mahogany table in his office, "I need you out there driving revenue, not stuck in here arguing with lawyers over compliance and stock issuance. Your value is in the chase. Do not bog yourself down with boardroom politics." It was a polite, sanitized way of keeping me locked in the engine room while he steered the ship. I accepted it because I was making more money in a single year than anyone in my Ohio hometown would see in a lifetime, and because I naively believed that the sheer undeniable weight of my financial results would eventually force them to give me a seat at the adult table. Then, the dynamic shifted entirely. Sloan Mercer returned to Charlotte. She had spent the last 8 weeks at an exclusive, ridiculously expensive executive management boot camp on the West Coast. She had never closed a single sale in her life. She had never negotiated a service-level agreement, managed a client crisis, or stayed up until 3 a.m. fixing a broken deployment schedule. Yet, upon her return, Rowan sent out a company-wide email announcing Sloan as the new vice president of strategy and the company's next-gen growth architect. It was a completely fabricated title designed to give her massive authority without requiring her to demonstrate a single ounce of competence. But Sloan was not stupid. She knew she lacked the substance to back up the title, and she knew exactly who possessed the blueprint she desperately needed. She attached herself to me like a shadow. "My father says you are the undisputed genius of this operation, Bailey," Sloane told me on her second day, leaning against the doorframe of my office with a perfectly practiced look of eager humility. "I know the academic theory, but you know the actual reality. I want to learn everything about how you built the enterprise division. I want to learn from the best." It was a master class in ego stroking, and to my eternal regret, it worked flawlessly. Sloane began accompanying me to every internal strategy session. She sat quietly in the corner during my most complex, high-stakes negotiations. When I stood at the whiteboard, mapping out custom deployment schedules for our most difficult clients, Sloane would pull out her phone and take high-resolution photographs of every single diagram. "Do you mind if I record this brainstorming session?" she would ask sweetly, holding up her sleek digital recorder. "You just speak so quickly, and I want to make sure I do not miss any of the brilliant nuances in your behavioral mapping." "Go right ahead," I would say, blindly handing her the keys to my kingdom piece by piece. She asked incredibly sharp, highly targeted questions. She did not ask about basic sales tactics. She asked about the deep architectural logic of my models. She wanted to know why I staggered the billing cycles in a specific way, or how I calculated the exact financial threshold for a client's risk tolerance. She was actively downloading my brain, categorizing my 6 years of grueling trial and error into neat, easily digestible bullet points in her expensive leather-bound notebook. I allowed it to happen because of my own deeply ingrained professional pride. I was operating under the fatally flawed assumption that if I successfully mentored the chief executive officer's daughter, if I turned her into a capable and respected executive, the board of directors would finally view me not just as a high-performing employee, but as an indispensable cornerstone of the institution. I thought I was buying permanent loyalty. I thought I was securing my eventual transition into the C-suite by proving I could build leaders just as effectively as I built revenue streams. I was profoundly wrong. I was not building a successor. I was arming my own assassin. I had spent my entire life trying to outrun the terrifying vulnerability I witnessed in my mother, only to meticulously build the exact weapon the Mercers would use to execute me. My pride had swung the heavy vault door wide open, and Sloane simply walked in, took the gold, and calmly changed the locks. Intellectual property theft in a corporate environment never happens in a sudden, dramatic heist. It does not announce itself with alarms or shattered glass. It happens inch by bloody inch. It is an insidious, creeping invasion that makes you question your own sanity long before you question your colleagues. It started with my calendar. I would log in at 7 in the morning to prepare for a crucial sync with the product engineering team, only to find the meeting had been moved to 3 in the afternoon. When I asked the organizers, they casually mentioned that Sloane had requested the shift to accommodate her new executive flow. Then, it was the customer relationship management software. Right in the middle of drafting a high-priority renewal proposal, my screen would flash a cold gray access denied error. For 2 hours, I would be locked out of my own pipeline. When I called the information technology help desk, the access would mysteriously return with a polite, dismissive email, blaming a temporary server migration. The most glaring early warning was my executive assistant, Marcus. I had spent 2 years training him to anticipate my operational needs. One Tuesday, I walked into the office to find his desk entirely cleared of his personal belongings. A brief sterile email from Human Resources informed me that due to cross-departmental optimization, Marcus was being permanently reassigned to support the Vice President of Strategy. I was left managing a multi-million-dollar portfolio with zero administrative cover, while Sloane had my right-hand man organizing her catered lunches. The true scope of the parasitic infection became undeniable exactly 1 week later at the quarterly leadership off-site retreat in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I sat in the second row of the dim conference room, nursing a lukewarm coffee, as Sloane took the stage to present the new corporate vision. The massive projector screen lit up behind her. My breath caught in my throat. It was my strategy deck, the slide architecture, the color-coded flowcharts, the granular data points, Analyzing buyer hesitation. It was exactly the framework I had built over 6 years of grueling trial and error. But the title slide did not bear my name or the original project title. In bold, aggressive lettering, it proudly announced the Mercer expansion stack. "What we have developed here," Sloan said smoothly, gripping the edges of the podium, "is a proprietary purchasing decision acceleration framework. We are moving beyond legacy sales tactics and diagnosing the root causes of client hesitation." I sat perfectly rigid, listening to a 26-year-old echo my exact cadence. She had swapped out a few of my original terms to create a thin illusion of novelty. My decision friction map was now her risk mitigation matrix. My behavioral retention loops were now her synergy renewal cycles. She delivered the presentation with absolute, terrifying conviction, accepting the enthusiastic nods of the executive team as if she had birthed the concepts herself. When we returned from the retreat, the structural theft escalated from intellectual to financial. I opened my digital dashboard to find my 3 largest, most lucrative enterprise accounts flagged with a new, unfamiliar tag. They had been reclassified as team accounts, on paper. A company-wide memo explained this was an initiative to foster cross-functional collaboration and ensure top-tier clients received holistic executive attention. In reality, when I dug into the back-end compensation portal, the revenue points attached to those renewals were no longer funneling exclusively into my division. They were quietly bleeding over into Sloan's performance scorecard. I refused to let it slide. I marched down to the 3rd floor and demanded a meeting with the Director of Human Resources. I laid out the timeline, the stripped accounts, and the plagiarized presentation deck. "This is not a collaborative effort," I stated firmly, keeping my voice low but sharp. "This is a systematic dilution of my division's performance metrics and a direct theft of my intellectual property." The director looked at me with the vacant, empathetic smile of a seasoned corporate hostage negotiator. She deployed a barrage of sterile, weaponized jargon designed to suffocate any legitimate complaint. "Bailey, we need to view this through the lens of strategic restructuring," the director said softly, folding her hands on her immaculate desk. "As the company scales, knowledge sharing becomes vital. We are simply optimizing organizational capacity. Your foundational work is highly valued, which is exactly why the executive team wants to integrate your learnings into a broader, unified growth model. You should view Sloan's adoption of your framework as a profound compliment to your leadership." I walked out of that office feeling completely hollowed out. They were stealing my house brick by brick and telling me I should be grateful they liked the color of the paint. The real turning point, the moment the simmering injustice morphed into cold, calculated survival, happened late on a Thursday night. I was alone in my apartment, staring at my laptop screen, when an encrypted message popped up on my phone. It was from Nora Bell. Nora was a brilliant, fiercely independent revenue operations specialist who had been abruptly let go 2 months prior under vague circumstances. "Watch the back-end timestamps," the message read. "Someone is altering the revenue recognition triggers after business hours. They are pulling forward numbers that do not exist yet. Protect yourself." I stared at the glowing text in the dark. If someone was artificially inflating the recognition timeline, they were not just stealing credit, they were cooking the books. The Mercer expansion stack was not merely a plagiarized sales strategy, it was a smokescreen for financial manipulation. From that night onward, my entire operational paradigm shifted. I stopped trying to prove my worth to a leadership team that was actively trying to consume me. Instead, I became a digital ghost in my own department. I started quietly harvesting the metadata of every crucial file. I archived endless email chains, saved time-stamped drafts of my original architectural models to an external, encrypted drive, and meticulously maintained handwritten notes documenting the exact phrasing and outcomes of every internal meeting. I did not do this out of some fiery desire for revenge. I did it because, for the very first time in my professional life, I felt the terrifying, icy realization that I could be completely erased from my own story. They were building a narrative where I was obsolete, and I needed absolute, irrefutable proof of my existence. The ultimate shock, the final nail that confirmed the true depth of the rot, arrived disguised as a routine compliance check. I was reviewing the final documentation for the Blackridge Health Consortium renewal. Blackridge was my crown jewel, a massive, infinitely complex account I had nurtured for 4 years. As I scrolled through the final digital contracts stored in the secure vault, my eyes snagged on a deployment addendum buried near the bottom of the 70-page document. I had never drafted this addendum. I had never approved it. I leaned closer to the monitor, reading the dense legal paragraphs. The hair on my arms stood up. The addendum promised Blackridge a highly customized, incredibly expensive data migration schedule, tying the payment triggers directly to our company delivering bespoke software features we did not actually possess yet. But the most chilling part was the logic behind it. The framework used to justify this impossible deployment schedule was a perfectly twisted, weaponized version of my own behavioral risk model. Sloan had taken the core principles of my strategy and used them to draft a legally binding promise that our engineering team could never fulfill, solely to force the client to sign before the quarter ended. She was using my brain to write checks the company could not cash, and when it inevitably blew up in their faces, my name was still technically the lead architect on the account. I was not just being replaced. I was being set up to take the fall for the biggest fraudulent disaster in the history of Vantage Arc Dynamics. When Sloan had stood up in that boardroom and proudly announced we had crossed the $100 million threshold, the sheer force of the applause had masked a glaring mathematical impossibility. The entire executive team had been swept into a manufactured euphoria, blinded by the dazzling optics of a record-breaking quarter, but while they were clapping, I was doing the math. The numbers on the glowing projector screen were completely impossible. I had stared at the column listing the finalized enterprise deals, and a chilling realization had washed over me. Several massive contracts included in that quarter's finalized revenue had not even reached their deployment activation milestones. According to basic accounting principles, you absolutely cannot recognize that cash yet. I remembered cutting through the applause with a highly specific, surgical question. "Rowan," I had said, my voice slicing through the celebratory noise, "how exactly are we structuring the rebates on the Vanguard and Apex accounts? Because if we are recognizing the full contract value today, but the deployment triggers and rebate clauses do not activate until the third quarter, we are in direct violation of standard revenue recognition policies. What are the specific milestones attached to this $100 million figure?" That was the exact moment Rowan had sprung his trap. He did not answer the question. He did not explain the accounting. Instead, he had instantly twisted my technical inquiry into a weapon. "This is exactly the problem, Bailey," he had fired back, his tone laced with heavy disappointment. "You are completely bogged down in rigid legacy thinking. You are no longer aligned with the vision of this company. Your aggressive questioning of our new growth model is disruptive and toxic." In less than 5 minutes, my valid concern about corporate fraud was repackaged as a fatal performance and attitude issue, culminating in my humiliating exit. The $100 million was just a spectacular fireworks display designed to distract everyone from the smell of burning books. Now, roughly 2 hours after being thrown out into the rain, I was sitting across from Elliott Vale inside a dimly lit, private dining alcove at the Capitol Grill. The heavy mahogany door was shut. I was still damp, my hair drying into a tangled mess, while Elliott sat perfectly manicured in his tailored charcoal suit. But despite our physical appearances, the power dynamic in the room was heavily skewed, and it was not leaning in his favor. "Blackridge Health Consortium called you directly," I stated flatly, skipping any polite preamble. "Tell me exactly what they said." Elliott shifted uncomfortably, gripping his crystal water glass. "They are completely enraged. Their lead procurement officer contacted my direct line. They demanded an immediate explanation for why the only person they trust, the only person who actually understands their system architecture, was unceremoniously fired the morning after they signed a massive expansion agreement. They signed based on the deployment addendum I supposedly approved," I countered, leaning forward until the candlelight illuminated the anger in my eyes. An addendum that promises them impossible deliverables based on a distorted version of my framework. Elliot waved his hand dismissively, though his eyes darted nervously toward the closed door. We can manage the deliverables later. Right now, we have a catastrophic optics crisis. If Blackridge pulls their legacy business, the ripple effect will trigger a massive sell-off. We need you back inside the building. Bailey. Immediately, he pushed a thick cream-colored envelope across the white tablecloth. I am not going back to work for Rowan, I said, ignoring the envelope. I would rather set my career on fire. You will not be reporting to Rowan, Elliot replied quickly, his voice tight with urgency. The board of directors is prepared to create a new, autonomous role for you. Chief Revenue Recovery Officer. You will bypass the executive suite entirely and report directly to me and the independent directors. You will have full authority over the enterprise division. You will have more power than you ever had under the Mercer regime. It was an incredibly tempting offer, a direct line to the board, complete autonomy, and a chance to rip my division back from Sloane's incompetent hands. But my survival instincts, honed by weeks of watching the Mercers steal my work inch by inch, were screaming at maximum volume. Something was profoundly wrong. Board members like Elliot did not react this frantically just because one client threw a tantrum. They were venture capitalists. They managed massive financial risks for a living. This was not risk management. This was blind panic. Why the sudden urgency? Elliot, I asked, keeping my gaze locked on his face. If Blackridge is just an optics issue, you send the crisis public relations team. You do not offer a fired employee a direct line to the board within 2 hours. What did the independent auditors say about the quarter close? Have you filed the preliminary numbers with the investors yet? Elliot tightened his jaw, the polite corporate mask slipping just a fraction. The audit is standard procedure. The investor relations team is handling the communications. We just need to stabilize the flagship accounts. You are dodging the question. I pushed harder, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I asked about the rebate structures in the boardroom, and Rowan panicked. He fired me because I accidentally touched the tripwire. Now you are sitting here, sweating through your silk shirt, begging me to come back and hold the Blackridge account together. Why did the board react so abnormally fast? What kind of investor pressure are you currently under? Bailey, you are overthinking this, Elliot insisted, forcing a tight, unconvincing smile. We simply recognize that a grave error in judgment was made by the chief executive officer regarding human capital. We are rectifying it. Do not look a gift horse in the mouth. Read the contract. Name your salary. Just fix the Blackridge situation before Monday morning. He was lying, or at the very least, he was heavily curating the truth. He wanted me back not to lead, but to act as a highly paid human shield. If Blackridge imploded because of the fraudulent addendum Sloane created, the board needed the original architect in the building to take the blame. They were offering me a promotion that was actually a beautifully decorated coffin. I picked up the envelope, feeling the heavy weight of the premium paper, and stood up from the table. I will review the terms this weekend, I said coldly. Do not call me again. I will contact you. I walked out of the restaurant, leaving Elliot alone with the check and his rapidly rising panic. The rain had finally stopped by the time I returned to my apartment. The silence of my living room felt heavy and suffocating. I dropped my damp coat on the sofa and opened my laptop, pulling up the encrypted files I had managed to secure over the past few weeks. The metadata, the time-stamped drafts, the erased logs. I needed to cross-reference every single account Sloane had claimed in her $100 million victory lap. I needed to find the exact mechanism they were using to pull future revenue into the current quarter. At exactly 11:42 that night, my cell phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. I picked it up. The screen displayed a new text message from an unknown, untraceable number. There was no greeting. There was no signature. It was just a single, chilling sentence that confirmed every dark suspicion I held. Do not save them until you know what they are burying. I read the words 3 times, the harsh blue light of the screen reflecting in my tired eyes. The board was not just covering up an incompetent executive or a single lost client. They were burying something massive, something entirely fatal to the company. And if I stepped back into Vantage Arc Dynamics blindly, I was going to be the one holding the shovel when the authorities finally arrived. I locked my front door, turned off the overhead lights, and sat back down at my computer in the dark. The rules of engagement had changed. I was not just fighting for my job anymore. I was fighting to burn their entire fraudulent empire to the ground. I did not return Elliot Vale's phone call on Saturday morning. Desperation is a highly volatile chemical, and I wanted the board of directors to marinate in it for at least 24 hours. If I rushed back to the negotiation table immediately, I would be playing the role of the grateful, vindicated employee. I had zero intention of being grateful, and vindication was no longer my primary objective. I needed leverage, and to get that, I needed to understand exactly what kind of fire Elliot was trying to put out. Instead of answering my phone, I drove across the city to a nondescript apartment complex to meet Nora Bell. Nora was the brilliant revenue operations specialist who had sent me the cryptic warning text the night before. Exactly 2 months ago, Human Resources had quietly managed her out of the company. They had cited a vague misalignment of cultural values, but everyone in the operational trenches knew the actual truth. Nora had been fired because she possessed the audacity to ask the chief financial officer why the pipeline forecasts looked miraculously perfect during a severe macroeconomic downturn. She had seen the cracks in the foundation, and they had buried her before she could hand anyone a flashlight. I sat at her small kitchen island and placed the tiny silver flash drive on the granite counter next to her lukewarm coffee. Someone slipped this into my box while I was being publicly slaughtered in the boardroom, I explained, keeping my voice perfectly level. I need to know if the data on this drive matches the shadow backups you pulled before they locked you out of the network. Nora did not say a word. She simply picked up the drive, plugged it into her heavily encrypted laptop, and began running a comparative diagnostic script. For the next 6 hours, we sat in absolute silence, interrupted only by the aggressive clicking of her keyboard and the hum of her cooling fan. We cross-referenced the raw system logs from the anonymous flash drive with the offline database Nora had smuggled out. The digital footprint we uncovered was astonishingly reckless. We watched the metadata tell a story of sheer, unadulterated panic. "Look at this timestamp," Nora said, pointing a pen at a string of code on her monitor. "This is the Apex Industries expansion. It was flagged as pending legal review at 5 o'clock on Wednesday evening. But at 2 o'clock in the morning on Thursday, someone manually overrode the system and flipped the status to closed won." "Who was the user?" I asked, leaning closer to the glowing screen. "It was a master administrative account," Nora replied, her eyes scanning the logs. "An account controlled directly by the executive suite. They bypassed every single standard compliance gate." We spent the afternoon dissecting Sloan's widely applauded $100 million milestone. It was a masterpiece of creative accounting and blatant fiction. A massive, undeniable portion of that number was phantom revenue. They had pulled forward tentative renewals from the third and fourth quarters, logging them as finalized cash for the current period. They were counting unsigned verbal commitments as legally binding contracts. Furthermore, they had systematically shoved millions of dollars in client rebate liabilities into the next fiscal year to artificially inflate the current profit margins. The entire growth narrative was a hollow shell. But the most lethal piece of evidence, the true kill shot, was hidden inside a restricted legal folder concerning the Blackridge Health Consortium. Nora decrypted a secondary file pathway, revealing a highly confidential side letter attached to the main Blackridge contract. I read the dense legal jargon twice, my blood running completely cold. Sloan, in her desperate bid to close the deal and secure her historic revenue number, had agreed to a catastrophic contingency clause. If Vantage Arc Dynamics failed to meet the exact custom deployment model promised in the addendum, the very addendum she had forged using my stolen behavioral framework, Blackridge had the legal right to completely freeze their expansion capital without incurring a single financial penalty. The picture snapped into terrifying focus. Blackridge was not just a disgruntled client. They were the structural linchpin of the entire fraudulent quarter. If I did not return to salvage that specific deployment, Blackridge would trigger the escape clause. The moment they pulled their money, the $100 million narrative would instantly disintegrate. The sudden, massive revenue void would trigger an immediate audit, and the Mercers would be caught holding the bag. I dug deeper into the corporate financial filings, tracking the dates on our massive growth loans. I found a strict debt covenant tied to our primary venture capital funding. The covenant required the company to maintain a specific quarterly revenue threshold to avoid defaulting on a $50 million credit facility. "Pull up the board meeting minutes from last week," I instructed Nora, my pulse steadying into a slow, rhythmic drumbeat. She executed the search. The board of directors had received the preliminary risk assessment report on Thursday afternoon. They knew about the impending covenant breach before Elliot ever picked up the phone to call me on Friday morning. They had not experienced a sudden moral awakening regarding my unfair dismissal. They had not realized Sloan was incompetent out of the goodness of their hearts. They were simply staring down the barrel of a catastrophic financial default, and they needed me to jump on the grenade to save their equity. Anger is a remarkably useless emotion when you are dealing with corporate sociopaths. It clouds your judgment, makes you predictable, and tricks you into fighting on their terms. I did not feel the hot, humiliating rage I had felt standing in the rain outside the office. I felt cold. I felt like a forensic pathologist examining a terminal tumor. I pulled a yellow legal pad from my leather tote bag and uncapped my pen. I was not going to write a polite counteroffer to Elliot Vale. I was going to draft a hostage ransom note. "What exactly are you doing?" Nora asked, watching me furiously write down bullet points. "I am pricing my return," I replied evenly, not looking up from the paper. "If the board wants me to fix the Blackridge account and save them from a federal financial investigation, I am not going back as a grateful employee. I am going back as the executioner." I outlined a list of non-negotiable conditions, designing each one specifically to strip the Mercers of their power and protect myself from being used as a legal shield. First, I demanded absolute executive control over the enterprise division, explicitly removing the requirement to report to Rowan or Sloan. Second, I required unrestricted, unmonitored administrative access to all financial databases, customer relationship management software, and legal archives. Third, I demanded the authority to hire my own independent forensic accounting team, entirely at the expense of the company. Finally, and most importantly, I wrote out a demand for a legally binding indemnification clause. Every single altered forecast, every pulled forward contract, and every deferred rebate from the past 6 months had to be officially documented in a formal board resolution. The board had to legally acknowledge the executive suite's errors in writing before I stepped foot inside the building. I was forcing them to build a paper trail that completely separated my name from their fraud. "They will never agree to those terms," Nora said, staring at the aggressive list on my yellow pad. "It is corporate suicide. You are asking them to officially document their own financial crimes before an auditor even arrives." "They will sign it," I said, tearing the yellow sheet from the pad and folding it precisely in half. "Because corporate suicide takes a few months to kill you. Blackridge is going to kill them on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. They are out of oxygen, and I am the only person holding a tank." I walked into the executive boardroom at exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning. The environment was drastically different from the public execution I had endured just 72 hours prior. The room was mostly empty. Rowan Mercer and his daughter were noticeably absent. Instead, 6 independent board members sat around the massive mahogany table. The air was thick with the distinct bitter smell of black coffee and suppressed panic. Elliot Vale sat at the head of the table, his usually immaculate suit looking slightly rumpled, his eyes betraying a severe lack of sleep over the weekend. I did not sit down. I did not wear the submissive, grateful posture of an employee who had been graciously invited back from exile. I stood at the opposite end of the table, placing my leather tote bag onto the polished wood, projecting the cold, detached authority of someone holding the absolute last oxygen valve on a suffocating submarine. Let us skip the corporate diplomacy, I began, my voice ringing clearly through the cavernous room. I know exactly why I am here. You do not just need my sales acumen. You need my personal credibility with the Blackridge Health Consortium. You need my fundamental understanding of the deployment architecture. Most importantly, you need my ability to look at your disaster of a ledger and differentiate between actual, banked cash and the decorative fiction your executive team used to inflate this quarter. Elliot cleared his throat, attempting to project a calm, authoritative demeanor that completely failed to reach his eyes. Bailey, we acknowledge that mistakes were made in the haste of the transition. We are prepared to offer you a highly lucrative reinstatement package. We can authorize a salary increase of 3 times your previous compensation, alongside a substantial performance bonus tied directly to the successful stabilization of the Blackridge account. I am not here to negotiate a salary multiplier. Elliot, I interrupted sharply, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. Cash is a temporary distraction. You are staring down the barrel of a massive debt covenant default because your flagship revenue number is a fabricated lie. If Blackridge walks away today, the entire $100 million house of cards collapses by tomorrow afternoon. I am not asking for a raise. I am pricing the survival of this entire institution. I reached into my bag, pulled out a single sheet of premium white paper, and slid it down the center of the table. It stopped directly in front of Elliot. Those are my terms, I stated flatly. I require a substantial equity grant, fully vested immediately upon signing. I require absolute veto power over every single enterprise revenue forecast before it is ever presented to the auditing committee or external investors. I want unrestricted, unmonitored access to all historical financial records and internal correspondence. Finally, I require a legally binding letter of exoneration, signed by every single person at this table, completely indemnifying me from any past financial discrepancies engineered by your executive suite. The silence in the room was absolute. The board members exchanged alarmed, heavy glances. They were venture capitalists and hedge fund managers. They recognized a hostage situation when they saw one. "This is completely unprecedented," a board member named Harrison muttered, adjusting his glasses nervously. "Giving you veto power over revenue forecasts effectively bypasses the chief financial officer. The indemnification clause alone reads like an admission of systemic guilt." "It is an admission of reality, Harrison," I countered without blinking. "You can sign that document and give me the authority to stop the bleeding, or I can walk out of this room, call the procurement officer at Blackridge, and tell them exactly why their deployment addendum is a mathematical impossibility. You have exactly 3 minutes to decide which headline you prefer." Elliot gripped the edges of the paper, his knuckles turning white. He hated me in that moment. He hated that I had completely seen through their desperate, self-serving motives. He realized I was not a pawn they could maneuver. I was the person holding the board hostage. "Fine," Elliot spat out, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "We will agree to the structural power shift and the legal waivers, but Rowan and Sloan Mercer must be terminated immediately. We need a clean slate to present to the auditors. We will announce their departure this afternoon." "No," I said instantly, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register. "Rowan and Sloan stay exactly where they are for now." Elliot stared at me, completely bewildered. "Why in the world would you want to keep the people who just publicly fired you and stole your framework? Because if you fire them today, they become scapegoats, and the trail of evidence ends with them," I explained, leaning forward and resting my hands on the table. "An operation of this magnitude does not happen in a vacuum. Sloan did not manually alter the database timestamps by herself. Rowan did not hide the rebate structures without help. They have a network of accomplices inside this building. If you fire the Mercers now, the rats will scatter and quietly delete their hard drives. I want to keep them comfortable. I want to watch who they talk to when the pressure starts building. I want to see exactly how wide the complicity network stretches before we burn it all down." Harrison exhaled a long, heavy breath, leaning back in his chair. He looked at Elliot. "She is right. We do not know where the bottom of this hole is yet. We have no better choice." Elliot rubbed his temples, visibly defeated by the sheer pragmatism of the strategy. "We will draft the legal paperwork by noon. You will be appointed as the interim Chief Revenue Recovery Officer. It is a newly created position. You will report exclusively to this board." The word interim was their pathetic, transparent attempt to maintain a sliver of psychological control. They needed me to believe my power was temporary. I let them have that comforting illusion. "Have human resources reactivate my keycard," I said, picking up my bag and turning toward the heavy oak doors. "And tell the legal department not to alter a single comma on my list of terms." 30 minutes later, the internal company network effectively caught fire. The announcement of my return, complete with a terrifying new executive title, hit the employee messaging channels like a localized earthquake. As I stepped out of the elevator and walked onto the main sales floor, the atmosphere was entirely unrecognizable from the day I had been escorted out. The frantic buzzing of $100 phone calls abruptly died. The aggressive frat house energy evaporated. People sat frozen at their desks, pretending to stare intently at their monitors. The colleagues who had actively avoided eye contact while the security guards marched me to the lobby were now shrinking into their ergonomic chairs, paralyzed by a mixture of deep fear and morbid curiosity. They knew I had not returned to play nicely. They knew a reckoning had just walked through the front door. I walked directly toward the glass-walled executive suite that used to be my goal. Sloane Mercer was standing just outside the door of my former office, holding a ceramic coffee mug. She wore a tailored crimson dress, projecting an aura of completely unbothered superiority. She clearly had no idea what had just transpired in the boardroom above her. "Welcome back, Bailey," Sloane said, offering a tight, patronizing smile that did not reach her eyes. Her tone was dripping with rehearsed condescension. "My father and I are glad you decided to accept the board's offer to return. We obviously hit a slight technical snag with the Black Ridge deployment framework. It is good to have our best operational plumber back in the building to patch up the leaky pipes." She truly believed the board had simply bullied me into returning to fix her mess. She thought I was just a highly paid maintenance worker, brought in to repair the engine so she could continue driving the sports car. I stopped walking and stood perfectly still, letting the silence stretch between us until her fake smile began to falter at the edges. I looked at the expensive fabric of her dress, then up to her perfectly manicured face. "I am not here to patch your pipes, Sloane," I said, my voice so soft it was almost a whisper, yet carrying enough weight to make her involuntarily take a half step backward. "I am here to evaluate the structural integrity of the foundation. Enjoy your office. I have a lot of reading to do." I walked past her without waiting for a response, heading straight for the secure records room. Let her think she was still in charge. Let her feel comfortable. It is always easier to catch a thief when they believe the alarms are permanently turned off. The Tuesday morning executive committee meeting was the first time the entire senior leadership team gathered in the same room since my public execution. The atmosphere was completely suffocating. Elliot Vale sat at the center of the table, acting as the board's direct proxy, while Rowan and Sloane Mercer sat opposite him. They looked like royalty who had just been informed that a peasant had breached the castle walls. I took a seat near the projector, opening my laptop with deliberate, unhurried precision. "Let us bring this meeting to order," Elliot announced, his voice tight and lacking its usual booming confidence. "The board of directors has finalized a structural reorganization, effective immediately. The newly created role of Interim Chief Revenue Recovery Officer will operate with full autonomy. All enterprise retention strategies, specifically the Black Ridge Health Consortium portfolio, fall entirely under this new jurisdiction. The board expects full, unhindered cooperation from every department." Rowan stared at me, a muscle feathering in his clenched jaw. Sloane traced the rim of her coffee cup, her eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits. "Understood," Rowan said smoothly, masking his fury behind a thin veneer of corporate compliance. "We welcome the extra hands on deck to execute our vision." My first order of business does not involve executing your vision, Rowan, I said, tapping a key on my laptop. The massive screen behind me illuminated, displaying the master administrative dashboard for our customer relationship management software. As of 8 o'clock this morning, I continued, I have initiated a universal system freeze on all quarterly pipeline adjustments. From this moment forward, no executive, director, or manager can alter a forecast status, push a rebate date, or pull forward a contract milestone without passing a dual-factor authentication protocol. Furthermore, every single modification will now require a mandatory, written justification log that carbon copies directly to the Independent Auditing Committee. The color rapidly drained from Rowan's face. In less than 60 seconds, I had completely choked off their oxygen supply. By demanding a transparent, permanently documented trail for every single database alteration, I had effectively paralyzed their ability to manipulate the numbers or cover their tracks. The phantom revenue machine was officially broken. Rowan did not yell. He was much too dangerous for that. Instead, he leaned back in his heavy leather chair and picked up a thick, unmarked manila dossier from the table. Transparency is a wonderful concept, Rowan said, his voice dropping to a low, theatrical rumble. It is a shame you did not practice it before your departure last week. The board might have given you this sweeping authority, but as Chief Executive Officer, my primary duty is to protect the intellectual property of this institution. He opened the folder and slid a stack of printed server logs down the polished mahogany table. Our internal security team ran a routine diagnostic over the weekend, Rowan announced to the room, making sure Elliot was watching him closely. We discovered that on the Thursday evening prior to your termination, exactly 45 gigabytes of highly classified pricing models, custom deployment architecture, and enterprise client profiles were exported from the secure server. The destination was an external, unencrypted hard drive. A heavy, terrified murmur rippled through the seated executives. Corporate espionage was the ultimate, unpardonable sin. Rowan was not just trying to fire me again. He was laying the groundwork for a crippling federal lawsuit. He was painting a narrative that I had known my days were numbered and had prepared to sell the company's most vital secrets to a competitor. Sloan instantly seized the opening, adding her own layer of toxic venom to the character assassination. It certainly clarifies the situation with the Black Ridge Health Consortium, Sloan noted, her voice laced with manufactured disappointment. We all wondered why a major procurement officer would threaten to pull a multi-million-dollar expansion over one employee. But when you actively blur the lines of professional boundaries, when you manipulate clients using highly personal, inappropriate leverage behind closed doors, it makes perfect sense. You did not build a system. You built a cult of personality, and then you tried to steal the blueprints when my father finally held you accountable. It was the dirtiest, most predictable weapon in the nepotism playbook. When you cannot attack a woman's undeniable competence, you attack her ethics and imply her success is derived from inappropriate personal favors. She wanted the board to see me as a toxic liability, a rogue agent who had seduced the clients and stolen the data. I did not flush with anger. I did not raise my voice to defend my honor. I simply reached into my leather tote bag and retrieved a slender blue folder bearing the embossed logo of the elite cybersecurity firm the board of directors had retained on Sunday. I anticipated you might find a data breach. Rowan, I said calmly, sliding my own document directly over his fabricated logs. Which is exactly why my first condition for returning was the authorization of an independent forensic audit. This is a sworn, notarized chain of custody report. I stood up and walked around the table, pointing to the highlighted text on the second page. You are absolutely correct that 45 gigabytes of proprietary data were exported on Thursday evening, I explained, making sure my voice carried to the back of the silent room. However, the independent forensic team traced the Internet Protocol address of the download. The extraction did not originate from my terminal. It originated from a newly generated service account, an account explicitly requisitioned by and registered directly to the new Vice President of Strategy. I looked directly at Sloan. The arrogant smirk vanished from her face instantly, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. "I surrendered my corporate laptop to your armed security guards on Friday morning," I continued, speaking with the cold, rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. "The independent auditors took possession of it on Sunday. The seal was unbroken. My hard drive is completely clean. But your administrative team, Sloan, used a backdoor service account to download the entire enterprise pipeline, presumably because you needed the raw data to figure out how my framework actually functioned after you stole the presentation slides." Elliot Vale snatched the blue folder from the table, his eyes darting frantically across the independent auditor's conclusions. The room was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. Rowan's smear campaign had not just failed. It had detonated in his own hands, exposing his daughter's staggering incompetence and their shared willingness to fabricate federal crimes to protect themselves. "We will review this documentation privately," Elliot stated sharply, glaring at Rowan with a look of absolute disgust. "This meeting is adjourned." The shift in the office power dynamic was instantaneous. Middle management is a highly sensitive organism. It survives by perfectly reading the direction of the wind. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the wind had permanently shifted. The Loyalists realized the Mercer dynasty was actively bleeding on the boardroom floor, and self-preservation kicked in. My encrypted inbox began to ping. It started as a slow drip, then turned into a steady flood. A regional sales director anonymously forwarded a voice note of Sloan explicitly ordering him to ignore the compliance gates on a massive software deal. A senior account manager sent me a terrifying cache of screenshots, showing Rowan directly instructing the team to verbally promise non-existent features to hit the quarterly target. They were handing me the exact weapons I needed, quietly abandoning the sinking ship to ensure their own survival. But the ultimate shock arrived the following morning. I walked into the executive corridor at 7 o'clock on Wednesday to find the door to the chief financial officer's suite standing wide open. Adrian Pike's executive assistant was standing in the center of the room, her hands covering her mouth in visible distress. "What happened?" I asked, stepping into the room. The office had been entirely sanitized. The family photos were gone from the desk. The diplomas had been stripped from the walls. "He is gone," the assistant whispered, pointing a trembling finger at the desk. "He sent an automated email at 3 o'clock in the morning canceling all his appointments for the next 90 days. I just checked his computer. The solid-state drive has been completely wiped with a military-grade overwrite protocol. Adrian Pike, the man who had officially signed his name to the fraudulent $100 million quarterly report, had vanished in the middle of the night. He knew I had frozen the system. He knew I was following the data trail. He had chosen to run rather than face the inevitable explosion. The walls were not just closing in on the Mercers anymore. The entire foundation of the company had just collapsed. I boarded a flight to Chicago at 6 o'clock on Thursday morning, landing just in time to catch a cab straight to the downtown headquarters of the Blackridge Health Consortium. I did not bring a sales team. I did not bring a public relations representative to smooth over the ruffled feathers. I walked into their massive, steel and glass executive suite, carrying only my laptop and the absolute certainty that the entire Vantage Arc Dynamics deployment model was built on quicksand. Marcus Vance, the lead procurement officer for Blackridge, was waiting for me in a sterile, windowless conference room. He did not offer me a coffee. He did not engage in polite small talk about the flight. He simply crossed his arms over his tailored suit and waited for me to speak. "I am not here to offer you corporate apologies, Marcus," I said, taking the seat across from him. "I am not here to assign blame to previous executives, and I am certainly not here to pretend the addendum you signed last week is functional. It is a mathematical impossibility. If we attempt to deploy that specific data migration schedule, your internal patient portal will crash within 14 days. Marcus leaned forward, his expression hardening. "So you flew all the way here to tell me my $100 million vendor is officially breaching contract before the ink is even dry. I flew here to stop you from driving your company off a cliff." I corrected him smoothly. "I know this architecture better than anyone on the planet because I built it. I need you to freeze the current deployment schedule immediately. Give me exactly 72 hours. I will completely rebuild the timeline, align the custom software integration with our actual engineering capacity, and deliver a revised framework that will absolutely guarantee your board of directors the early wins they expect. Marcus studied me for a long, heavy moment. He was a veteran of corporate vendor warfare. He recognized the difference between a panicked salesperson and a surgeon holding a scalpel. 72 hours, Marcus agreed slowly. But there is a catch. Bailey, we are not paying a single dime extra for the back-end adjustments. Your Vice President of Strategy explicitly promised us a dedicated growth support fund to cover all the custom engineering costs for the first year. We expect that fund to remain fully active. I kept my face perfectly neutral, actively suppressing the sudden, violent spike in my heart rate. Of course, the Growth Support Fund. I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. Vantage Arc Dynamics did not possess a growth support fund. We never subsidized custom engineering costs. It fundamentally violated our margin requirements. The moment I returned to my hotel room, I called Nora. I need you to dig into the Blackridge ledger right now, I instructed, pacing the length of the carpeted room. Look for any financial vehicle labeled as a growth support fund. Sloan promised them subsidized engineering, and she had to draw that money from somewhere. For 3 hours, I sat on the edge of the hotel bed while Nora relentlessly audited the shadow databases from her apartment. The deeper she dug, the more the smell of corporate rot filled the air. I found it, Nora finally said, her voice echoing through the phone speaker with a sharp edge of disbelief. It is not an internal fund. The money was routed through a third-party vendor, a middleman entity called Lattice North Partners. According to the ledger, Vantage Arc Dynamics paid Lattice North nearly $2 million in consulting fees over the past 3 months. And Lattice North turned around and used that money to subsidize the Blackridge engineering costs, making it look like a free perk to the client. I deduced, feeling the pieces snap together into a horrifying picture. Who owns Lattice North? Give me 10 minutes to run the state incorporation records, Nora replied. When she called back, the silence on the line felt incredibly heavy. Lattice North Partners is a shell corporation, Nora explained quietly. It only exists on paper. It is registered to a post office box in Delaware. But if you follow the incorporation signature, it leads directly to a private wealth management group, a family trust, Bailey. I closed my eyes. The Mercer Family Trust. Exactly, Nora confirmed. The $100 million milestone was no longer just a desperate attempt to inflate the quarterly numbers or steal my professional credit. It was blatant, systematic self-dealing. Rowan and Sloan were siphoning massive amounts of corporate capital out of the company under the guise of vendor consulting fees, funneling it into their own family trust, and using a fraction of it to secretly bribe clients like Blackridge to sign impossible contracts. They were looting the ship before it sank. I immediately thought of Elliott Vale. The board of directors had to know. As the lead venture capital partner, Elliott would have an absolute aneurysm if he discovered the chief executive officer was actively embezzling company funds. I reached for my phone, fully prepared to dial Elliott's private number and detonate the entire Mercer dynasty. But survival instincts are a funny thing. They make you pause just long enough to see the trap. Nora, I said, my hand hovering over the phone screen. Before I call the board, I need you to pull the signature authorizations on the recent bridge financing loan. The one Elliott secured to keep the company afloat last month. Pulling the loan documents now, Nora said. I heard the rapid clicking of her keyboard. Okay, I have the master credit agreement. The loan was secured against the projected revenue from the enterprise division. Specifically, the inflated $100 million figure. Who signed the risk assessment validation for the lender? I asked, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Adrian Pike signed as Chief Financial Officer, Nora read aloud, and Elliott Vale signed as the lead independent director. The floor completely dropped out from beneath me. Elliott was not my ally. He was not the naive venture capitalist who had just woken up to Rowan's incompetence. Elliot had personally signed off on a massive corporate loan using fraudulent revenue projections. He knew the numbers were fake. He had to know. That was exactly why he had panicked so violently when Blackridge threatened to walk away. If the Blackridge deal collapsed, the entire revenue projection would shatter. The lender would immediately audit the loan, and Elliot would be facing federal fraud charges alongside Rowan. The danger multiplied exponentially in my mind. I was no longer just fighting the Mercers. I was fighting the very people who had hired me to clean up the mess. Elliot did not want me to fix the company. He wanted me to keep the Blackridge account alive just long enough for his venture capital firm to quietly offload their equity and escape the blast radius. If I exposed the Lattice North embezzlement right now, Elliot would destroy me to protect his own signature on that loan. I ended the call with Nora and sat in the quiet hotel room, listening to the muffled sounds of the city traffic below. I was entirely surrounded by predators. They all needed me to play a specific role in their survival, and the moment my utility expired, they would unanimously agree to make me the ultimate scapegoat. I opened my laptop and created a brand new, heavily encrypted master folder. I divided the screen into 2 separate workspaces. In the first workspace, I began building a sanitized, highly functional deployment schedule for Blackridge. This was the operational file. It was the exact blueprint I needed to keep the client happy, satisfy the board of directors, and maintain the illusion that I was playing the game by their rules. In the second workspace, I began assembling the kill file. I meticulously copied the Lattice North Partners payment ledgers. I archived the Delaware State Incorporation documents linking the shell company to the Mercer family. I saved the bridge financing agreement bearing Elliot Vale's signature, explicitly highlighting the fraudulent revenue projections he had authorized. I structured the entire dossier like a federal indictment, compiling undeniable, mathematically perfect evidence of both the embezzlement and the board's complicity in the cover-up. I did not save this second folder to the company server. I sealed it, encrypted it with a 32-character passcode, and mirrored the drive to an offline server completely outside the jurisdiction of Vantage Arc Dynamics. It was ready to be instantly deployed to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the independent auditing firm, and the primary corporate lenders at the push of a single button. For the first time since this nightmare began, my objective completely shifted. I no longer cared about reclaiming my title. I did not care about the salary, the equity, or the corner office. Those things belonged to a system that was fundamentally rotten to its absolute core. I was going to walk back into that glass tower, look every single one of them in the eye, and force them to drown in the very swamp they had created. The atmosphere inside the executive corridor on Wednesday evening was thick with the suffocating pressure of an approaching storm. The building was mostly empty, the standard hum of the sales floor replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. I was sitting at my desk, meticulously finalizing the secondary encrypted dossier, when the soft click of my office door closing made me look up. Sloane Mercer stood inside my office. She reached out and twisted the plastic wand on the glass wall, snapping the horizontal blinds shut with practiced, deliberate ease. She did not look like the untouchable heiress who had mocked me in the hallway 2 days ago. Her tailored blazer was slightly wrinkled, and the arrogant, patronizing smirk had completely vanished. She looked exactly like someone who realized the ice beneath her feet was cracking. "Let us drop the corporate theater, Bailey," Sloane said. Taking the guest chair across from my desk, she kept her voice low, almost a whisper. "We both know the auditing committee is convening tomorrow morning. We both know the numbers are slightly aggressively positioned. I am here to offer you a permanent solution." "I am listening," I replied, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. "My father and the board are prepared to elevate you from your interim role," Sloane stated, her eyes locking onto mine with desperate intensity. "We will officially name you the Chief Revenue Officer of Vantage Arc Dynamics. You will have a permanent seat on the executive board, a massive equity grant, and complete operational control over every single division." I did not blink. "And what exactly is the price of that permanent seat?" "Sloane, Sloane pulled a thin, legal-sized folder from her designer bag and placed it on my desk. A signature. It is a standard, ironclad non-disclosure agreement. In exchange for the title and the equity, you will publicly confirm to the auditing committee tomorrow that the $100 million milestone was accurate and that any underlying discrepancies were simply a harmless difference in accounting classification. An administrative oversight regarding how we categorize future pipeline commitments. It was a beautiful, toxic trap. She was offering me the exact crown I had bled for over the last 6 years, but she was demanding I wear it while sinking on her ship. If I signed that paper, I became legally complicit in the fraud. I would be the executive on record validating their phantom numbers. I did not reject the offer immediately. Anger would tell her she had failed, and I needed her to believe she still had a chance. I needed to stretch the timeline to see what else the Mercer dynasty would expose in their panic. "Leave the paperwork on my desk," I said, my tone perfectly neutral, projecting the aura of a woman heavily weighing her greed against her morals. "I will review the legal clauses tonight. I will give you my final answer before the committee convenes tomorrow." Sloane exhaled a long, shuddering breath, a flash of profound relief washing over her face. She thought she had found my price. She stood up, offered a tight nod, and slipped out of my office. 10 minutes later, a company-wide email notification flashed across my monitor. It was from Rowan Mercer. He was officially summoning all 500 employees to a mandatory, all-hands meeting at 8 o'clock the following morning, specifically framing it as a celebration of our return to stability. It was a blatantly transparent, deeply manipulative tactical move. Rowan was trying to lock in the public narrative before the audit committee even sat down. If he paraded me in front of the entire company as his loyal, returning champion, it would make it infinitely harder for me to tear him down behind closed doors. I turned my attention back to the server. I needed to verify the exact timestamps on the Apex Industries ledger one final time. I clicked the secure pathway to the master shared directory. An error message flashed in stark red letters across my screen. The folder could not be found. My heart slammed against my ribs. I refreshed the system architecture, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Nothing. The entire shared directory containing the raw, unfiltered first quarter revenue logs had been completely wiped clean. Rowan was not just locking the narrative, he was systematically destroying the evidence. I immediately dialed Nora's encrypted number. "They purged the master directory," I said the second she answered, fighting to keep the panic out of my voice. "The original revenue logs are gone. Every single file detailing the pulled forward contracts has been deleted from the primary server." I heard the rapid, aggressive clicking of Nora's mechanical keyboard on the other end of the line. "Do not panic," she muttered, her voice tight with absolute focus. "They executed a hard wipe on the front-end servers, but they are incredibly arrogant. They forgot about the legacy synchronization protocols." For 3 agonizing minutes, I sat in silence, listening to her type. "Got it," Nora finally breathed out, a triumphant edge cutting through the tension. "When they updated the enterprise software last year, they never decommissioned the old shadow backup server. It automatically mirrors the master directory every 12 hours. I am pulling the entire uncorrupted file tree right now. We have the data. Bailey, every single deleted byte." I closed my eyes, letting a wave of icy relief wash over me. "Lock it down. Print physical copies. Do not let it touch the company network again." By 9 o'clock that evening, I was sitting in my dimly lit living room, reviewing Nora's recovered files, when my phone vibrated with a priority email alert. It was a formal communication from Marcus Vance at the Blackridge Health Consortium. It was not a friendly check-in. It was a devastating, legally binding ultimatum. The letter explicitly stated that if Vantage Arc Dynamics published a single inaccurate financial figure at the audit meeting, or if the board attempted to minimize or distort my exclusive authority over the deployment architecture, Blackridge would immediately activate the suspension clause. The threat was absolute. They were holding a loaded gun to the head of the entire company, and my credibility, was the only thing stopping them from pulling the trigger. Just before midnight, my secure messaging application chimed. The sender was anonymous, but the coordinates attached to the message directed me to a deserted parking garage 3 blocks from my apartment. When I arrived, 2 senior account directors were waiting in the shadows between the concrete pillars. They were the 2 highest billing representatives in my former division. They looked completely exhausted, haunted by the crushing weight of what they had been forced to do. "We cannot go into that meeting tomorrow and lie anymore, Bailey," the first director said, his voice echoing hollowly against the concrete. "Rowan cornered us 3 weeks before you were fired. He threatened to completely strip our commission tiers unless we agreed to manually tag all of your enterprise revenue to Sloan's internal campaign code. They forced us to build the succession narrative for her. We have the original email directives from Human Resources, proving it was a mandated directive." They handed me a thick manila envelope containing the printed correspondence. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling directly into my hands. The Mercer loyalists were breaking rank, terrified of the impending federal fallout. I drove back to my apartment, my mind racing with the sheer volume of ammunition I had gathered. I thought the night could not possibly yield any more surprises. I was wrong. At 2 o'clock in the morning, my cell phone rang. It was an unrecognized number from a Washington, D.C. area code. I answered cautiously. "Am I speaking with Bailey Cook?" a sharp, highly polished male voice asked. "You are? Who is this?" "My name is Jonathan Hayes. I am a criminal defense attorney," the voice stated smoothly. "I represent Adrian Pike, the former chief financial officer of Vantage Arc Dynamics. My client is currently in a secure, undisclosed location, but he wishes to offer you a highly sensitive proposition." I sat up straight on my sofa, the exhaustion instantly vanishing from my body. Adrian Pike, the man who had vanished into thin air, was reaching out from the dark. "What does Adrian want?" I asked coldly. "Immunity," the lawyer replied without hesitation. "Adrian knows you have the shadow ledgers. He knows you are preparing to detonate the Mercers tomorrow morning. He is willing to provide you with the master encryption keys to the secret rebate subledger, as well as his personal, handwritten minutes from the executive forecast adjustment meetings. In exchange, he wants your guarantee that you will present his cooperation favorably to the independent auditors and the federal investigators." Adrian was holding the smoking gun. The handwritten minutes would conclusively prove that Elliott Vale and the board of directors knew the revenue was fraudulent before they signed the bridge financing loan. "Send the encryption keys to my secure server," I demanded, staring at the dark walls of my apartment. "If the minutes verify the board's complicity, I will make sure the auditors know he handed me the weapon." The files arrived in my inbox exactly 10 minutes later. I sat alone in the quiet darkness of my living room until the sky outside my window began to turn a bruised, pale gray. The sun was rising on the most critical day of my professional life. Sloan had tried to buy my silence with a title. Rowan had tried to trap me with a public celebration. The board had tried to buy my complicity with a massive salary and false authority. I looked at the finalized kill file glowing on my laptop screen. The decision was absolute and terrifyingly clear. I was not going to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I was not going to smile at a company-wide celebration. And I was absolutely not going to help the board of directors cover up their catastrophic negligence. I was going to walk into that boardroom, lock the doors, and force every single one of them to face the brutal, uncompromising truth. The heavy oak doors of the master boardroom closed with a definitive thud, sealing us inside. The room was packed to absolute capacity. The independent audit committee, the lead corporate lenders, the external auditors, and Marcus Vance representing Blackridge Health Consortium all sat around the massive mahogany table. Rowan Mercer stood at the head of the room, radiating an entirely fabricated aura of triumphant leadership. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, looking every inch the visionary founder. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered today not just to review a quarter, but to celebrate a historic milestone for Vantage Arc Dynamics," Rowan announced, clicking his presentation remote. A dazzling bright blue slide flashed onto the projector screen, displaying a massive graphic of the $100 million revenue achievement. Through our unified growth model, we have completely shattered industry expectations. I sat halfway down the long table. I did not raise my hand. I did not wait for an invitation. I simply stood up, walked directly to the auxiliary console at the front of the room, and plugged my encrypted flash drive into the primary presentation matrix. "I request the floor," I stated, my voice slicing through the polite murmurs of the room. I overrode his presentation feed. The bright blue victory slide vanished instantly, replaced by a stark, black and white grid of raw metadata. It was the recovered shadow ledger Nora had pulled from the legacy servers. "There is no historic milestone," I said, projecting my voice clearly to the back of the room. I bypassed emotional accusations and went straight for the mathematical throat. "The $100 million figure you are currently looking at is a legally actionable fabrication." Rowan lunged forward, his face flushing crimson. "Turn that screen off immediately. You are completely out of line. Bailey, security will remove you." "Let her speak," Marcus Vance interrupted. His voice carried the chilling weight of a multi-million-dollar client holding the ultimate kill switch. He looked directly at Rowan with absolute disgust. "If anyone stops her presentation, Blackridge Health Consortium withdraws every single cent of our capital by noon today. Proceed, Bailey." Rowan froze, completely trapped. I clicked to the next slide, revealing the precise history of the contract modifications. "Let us peel back this $100 million number layer by layer," I instructed the room. I pointed to a cluster of red highlighted rows on the spreadsheet. "First, $22 million of this figure consists of enterprise renewals manually pulled forward from the third and fourth quarters, recorded as finalized cash today by an administrative override. Second, $15 million represents verbal promises on custom deployments that have not reached a single contractual activation milestone." I clicked the remote again. A complex financial flow diagram appeared, showing the diverted rebate structures. Furthermore, millions of dollars in client rebate liabilities were systematically shoved into the next fiscal year to artificially inflate the current profit margin, I explained. Then, I delivered the final, fatal blow. "And the growth support funds used to bribe clients into these impossible timelines were funneled directly through a shell corporation called Lattice North Partners, an entity completely owned by the Mercer Family Trust." The entire room erupted into a deafening chaos of overlapping voices. The lead corporate lender slammed his hands on the table. The independent auditors scrambled frantically to pull up their own preliminary risk reports. Marcus Vance stood up, his face an impenetrable mask of corporate fury. "Blackridge Health Consortium will not do business with a fraudulent executive suite. We are formally stating for the official record that we will only continue our partnership if Bailey Cook assumes absolute direct control over our deployment architecture, and every single fabricated addendum is formally retracted in writing today." Elliot Vale stood up so fast, his heavy leather chair crashed backward onto the carpet. His face was completely ashen. He knew the embezzlement exposure was fatal, and he desperately needed to stop the bleeding before it reached his own signature on the corporate loans. "This is highly alarming," Elliot shouted over the noise, attempting to seize control of the rapidly disintegrating narrative. "We need to pause this meeting immediately. The board of directors will convene in a closed session to handle this internal matter." "We are not going into a closed room, Elliot," I fired back, my voice echoing off the glass walls. "Either the official minutes of this meeting reflect exactly who knew what and exactly when they knew it, or I am sending my secondary encrypted dossier directly to the federal authorities and your limited partners." "Bailey, be reasonable," Elliot pleaded, the authoritative venture capitalist completely breaking down into a panicked man trying to save his career. "You do not understand the full financial context of the funding rounds." "I understand it perfectly," a new voice echoed through the boardroom speakers. Everyone turned toward the conference phone sitting in the center of the table. Jonathan Hayes, the criminal defense attorney, had patched his client directly into the secure audio feed. "This is Adrian Pike," the former chief financial officer said, his voice tinny but unmistakably clear. "I am submitting formal testimony under legal counsel." Elliot Vale was explicitly briefed on the inflated revenue numbers 3 weeks ago. He fully authorized the bridge financing loan anyway, directly instructing the executive team that the growth narrative had to be maintained at all costs until after the refinancing round cleared. Elliot collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. The silence that followed Adrian's confession was absolute and completely destructive. The board had just been caught aiding and abetting corporate fraud in front of their own lenders. Rowan, backed into a corner with absolutely no remaining exits, turned on the only person left. He pointed a shaking finger at his own daughter. "This entire disaster falls on the strategy department," Rowan yelled, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "Sloan executed those database overrides. Sloan authorized the Lattice North payments. I trusted my vice president of strategy to manage the framework, and she completely failed to maintain compliance." Sloan stared at her father, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated horror. The man who had handed her the kingdom was now throwing her directly under the executioner's blade to save his own neck. "Are you insane?" Sloan screamed back, completely abandoning any professional decorum. Her voice was shrill and panicked. "You told me to do it. You literally stood in my office and told me to borrow Bailey's behavioral framework because I did not understand the math. You told me we just needed to survive this one single quarter, and we could fix the ledgers later. You made me sign those shell company transfers." The room watched in stunned, morbid fascination as the Mercer dynasty completely detonated in real time. A father and daughter screaming at each other, tearing each other apart in front of the very people who had once given them standing ovations. The fallout was swift and absolute. Before the audit committee even adjourned for lunch, Rowan Mercer was formally stripped of his title and forcibly removed from the building by the exact same security team he had weaponized against me just a few days prior. Sloan Mercer was terminated with extreme prejudice, her corporate assets frozen pending a joint civil and criminal investigation into the embezzlement. Elliot Vale did not escape the blast radius. The lenders demanded he be immediately placed under an independent legal review, effectively destroying his standing as a venture capital partner. I did not accept the permanent chief executive officer title. I demanded the board appoint me strictly as the interim chief revenue officer. Before I signed a single document, I forced the remaining board members to execute a public, legally binding exoneration clearing my name of any involvement in the Mercer fraud. I mandated the immediate creation of a restitution fund to restore the stolen commissions to the account directors who had been coerced by Rowan. Finally, I implemented a transparent, immutable oversight mechanism for every single future revenue forecast. I had won. The people who had tried to bury me were now buried under the rubble of their own arrogance. But as I walked out of the boardroom, I did not feel a sense of triumphant joy. I did not stand over the ashes and smile. At 8 o'clock the next morning, the entire company gathered in the main atrium for the all-hands meeting Rowan had so arrogantly scheduled. The 500 employees stood in absolute silence, staring up at me as I walked to the center stage. They were terrified, exhausted, and waiting for someone to tell them what the future held. I stepped up to the microphone. I looked at the sea of faces, people who had been manipulated, lied to, and nearly dragged down by a corrupt family. I did not offer them corporate platitudes. I did not promise them an easy journey. "The truth does not save this company," I said, my voice cold, short, and echoing through the massive glass atrium. "The truth only ends the charade. The rest, we have to rebuild ourselves." Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and please drop a comment below, letting me know where in the world you are tuning in from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.